The ongoing unrest and violence that we are seeing today on our college campuses and indeed across the globe is a clash of cultures. It is a clash of cultures between the Christian society, the Jewish society, and the Islamic society. The Islamic society, which can easily be seen as a challenger society to democracy. Today at the Centrist Inc., we welcome for our very first guest, Dr. William Gawthrop. Dr. Gawthrop has had a long military intelligence and analyst career beginning in Vietnam, going all the way through Iraq. He's going to be telling us some very interesting stories today. He will impart to us his wisdom and his vast experience, which is pertinent to what we are seeing in today's society. Please welcome Dr. William Gawthrop. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Do I refer to you as Dr.
Bill?
Bill.
Just Bill.
Bill. Very good. Very good. So I was going to talk to you about your book, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. But when I was reading your bio and your resume, I was absolutely fascinated. You've had a remarkable life. Did you get drafted in Vietnam, or did you join up?
I volunteered.
You volunteered?
I volunteered to be a light weapons infantryman, and I was sent to Vietnam, and I was assigned my first tour with Company H of the 75th Infantry with the 1st Cav Division. And then on my second tour, I served as an MP, and then in 72, I ETS and went back to school on the GI Bill.
Why did you pick military policing?
Well, there was actually an interesting phenomenon going on at the time with soldiers in Vietnam. You had fraggings and homicides where soldiers were behaving as an insider threat to their chain of command. And after a while, it occurred to me that law enforcement was going to be my avocation. And I figured that it would be a practical exercise to become an MP and pursue a criminal justice career through them and later on in the civilian life.
So very early on, you were aware of insider threats.
Not in those terms, but yes.
And so what kinds of things would you do? Because the reason I ask that right now is because we have technology now, and we can investigate people in a lot of different ways that you didn't have access to back then.
Correct.
So I would imagine it was a lot more difficult.
The phenomenon of the insider threat or the fragging, later on in my tour as an MP, I became a military police investigator and then ultimately a criminal investigator. And as a line MP, I would respond to incidents of fraggings. And then I'd conduct the preliminary interviews. And later, as a military police investigator and soon to be a criminal investigator, I would pick up where the MP's interviews ended and conduct the investigation, and a pattern arose with the fraggings. And the pattern was that a malcontent would mouth off and become a personality within the unit as a malcontent, and then in the stereotypical scenarios in the rear echelon areas where the fraggings occurred, you would find that the subject of the investigation would start harassing the victim. Now, the victim would be a senior non-commissioned officer or commissioned officer, and the harassment would be sometimes throwing rocks on the tin roof of their barracks, or after that, lobbing in a smoke grenade, and then culminating in either a fragmentation grenade or a booby trap. So there was a pattern that was starting to develop, and you could identify early on who some of the troublemakers are going to be by virtue of their verbal utterances and harassing actions that were increasing up to the use of deadly force. Once we had a deadly force situation where somebody threw a grenade and maybe caused an injury or a death, it was a simple matter to backtrack. Okay, what did the victim endure? Well, before the fragging, there was a smoke grenade or a concussion grenade or rocks on the roof or what have you. And you started backtracking and asking the question, who was likely to do something like that, or who had been seen doing something like that. And then it became an exercise in a custodial interview where you brought the individual in and you advised them of their rights, you get a knowledgeable waiver, and then you began an interview process. And invariably, the person would begin to disavow any knowledge of what was happening. And you had to be very, very persistent identifying the problems in their testimony, the reporting of their relationships with other troublemakers in the unit, eyewitness accounts of running from the scene or what have you. And one of the things that we discovered and really helped out in the fragging cases, you have left-handed throwers and right-handed throwers. And the military teaches that the left-handed thrower holds the grenade upside down and pulls the pin and throws it. The right-handed thrower holds the grenade right side up or fuse side up, pulls a pin and throws it. With a right-handed throw, the grenade handle will flip off, and if I remember correctly, flip off and eject to the right of the throwing trajectory, and it will fall about a third, maybe about a third of the distance from where the thrower is or where the grenade first impacts, knowing that it could roll after that. The left-handed thrower would throw the grenade, then the handle would eject downward and off to the left, about a quarter of the distance. So, as a result of that, you could take a look at where the grenade handle was found and draw a line on either side of the grenade handle for a right-handed or left-handed thrower and figure out where the grenade first impacted, not where it exploded and rolled to, but where it first impacted. And then you could shoot a azimuth back to a possible location. Now, the possible location that you were looking for was anything that would conceal the thrower from view, from behind the tent, a vacant connex or what have you. And then it became a question of who was seen in that area, who lived in there, who frequented that area or what have you. So you can build it up with physical evidence. The technology that we have today would probably make it a lot easier, but back then, once you broke the code on the patterns, it became pretty easy because every company commander, every battalion commander, sergeant major, and first sergeant generally has a list of their problem children, and they become the natural first order of interviews in a fragging case. That particular experience of looking for patterns was later to facilitate my role as an intelligence analyst looking at Islamic threats.
And that leads me to one of the questions that I had for you today was, when did Islam cross your path? When did you become aware of it?
Probably in the early 80s.
Okay.
And the reason I say that, when was that?
You talk about...
the early 80s, when a friend of mine, I was in a motorcycle group back then, and he said, "Hey, I found this at work, or it was given to me, and I don't need it." And he handed me a hardbound copy of the Quran. And as an intelligence or as a criminal investigator, I started looking at it, and I found some peculiar passages, but I never threw the book away. And then we had some Islamic activity and, of course, the harassment of the Jews. And my father, who fought in World War II, the greatest generation, took me aside even as a young child. And he said, "Always protect the Jews." And he explained to me what Hitler had done, the final solution, the Holocaust. And he said, "Whoever is an adversary of the Jew is going to be your adversary also."
Correct.
Anybody that burns books will later burn people. So always protect the Jew. So gradually my attention began to focus on the Islamic phenomenon. And then when I got a degree in criminal justice and went back into the Army as a second lieutenant in the military police corps, I didn't run into too much Islamic activity at that time, but I kept that in the back of my mind.
Was this when you were in Germany, or did you see it more when you were in Iraq? Because your military career takes you to South Korea, and I have a question that I wanted to ask you about that concerning, you talk about rear battle analysis.
Yes, rear battle analysis. Rear battle analysis is looking at how the enemy projects his forces into your rear areas to disrupt your operations, or uses what we would call now insider threats to disrupt your operations. So rear battle analysis became a military police security specialty, and it required a level of analysis that could be easily applied to the forward projections on the battlefield.
That's very interesting. And you talk about preparation, surveillance, intel collection, enemy capabilities, and attack methods.
Yes.
So between South Korea and Germany, what was happening in the world at the time? What kinds of things were you involved in the military?
Germany was in the process of reunification, and eventually it reunified. The Berlin Wall came down.
Okay.
And while I was there, we had the war in Iraq. And I had the opportunity to participate in Operation Provide Comfort, which sent me to Zaku, Iraq. And we looked at...
and what year was that? 2009, 8?
I don't remember. We're going back a long time ago.
Were you aware of Islam at the time, though, before?
Well, I had to be, simply because we were going into an Islamic country.
Right.
And it didn't present itself as a threat at that time, because the real problem was Saddam Hussein and his abuse of his citizens. My real focus on Islam, of course, started on 9/11. I was at the National Security Agency at the time, and I can remember going down to the supply room to get supplies like pens, paper, a lot of paper. The agency goes through a lot of paper. And a television screen was on, and one building had already been struck. And somebody said, "Oh my God," and I turned my attention to the screen, and you see the jet impacting the second building.
I remember that.
And so by the time I went back upstairs, we had a tasker to identify all the passengers on the 2 aircraft, and later the 3rd aircraft that crashed in Pennsylvania, and start working the issue of who could likely be the individuals concerned. And based on my prior experience, we identified all the possibles, and then started drilling down into their backgrounds and came up with what ultimately would have been the list of 19 jihadists.
So you talk about situational awareness, I guess, that maybe we missed. Such situational environment is how you describe it in your book. And so prior to 9/11, you were analyzing explosives, you say, and the persons of interest both internationally and in the U.S., tracking and finding subversives at the time, providing expertise in Islamic law and jihad at the time. So when 9/11 happened, did you think that we missed the situational environment, that we could have gotten those guys and thwarted it before it happened?
It wasn't apparent to me at the time that we had missed so many cues, simply because my analytic focus was somewhat directed in another target. And I wasn't aware of what would later be identified as a number of deficiencies in government awareness about Islam and jihad. Shortly after 9/11, I had the opportunity as a contractor to go to Sarajevo, where I served a tour there, and became acutely aware of the difference between the Serbs and the Muslims. And we had two individuals that were contractors for SAIC and the National Intelligence Center, the NIC, in Sarajevo. And these two gentlemen were actually high school and elementary school friends that grew up together. One was Muslim and the other one was a Serb. I believe the cultural term is Bosniak for the Muslim and the Serbs. And of course, one was, both of them grew up in Sarajevo, and there really hadn't been that much of an emphasis on observing Islamic customs until Mustafa Sarık became the senior imam for Sarajevo, and he really clamped down on behavior, enforcing the restrictions and making people enforce restrictions on themselves and what have you. So up until this time...
And you saw that? You saw some of that playing out?
Some of it, yeah. But the important thing was that Lola and Mookie were the two individuals, and they would give a tour. And because one was Muslim and the other one was Serb, their tour was very interesting because as high school friends, they were assigned to do two different military units opposing each other. And it just so happened that the two units would shift in tandem across or along the front lines. And so Mookie would wave across the battlefield to his friend Lola, and he would wave back, and then he would give an arm and hand signal indicating that there was probably going to be an attack later on for Lola to lay low and get out of the way.
Incredible.
So even among friends, you were sharing information. But Mookie had to become more Islamic as time went on. Well, after the war ended, these two guys became friends. They started giving tours of the battlefield. And there was one piece of instruction that he gave the intelligence analysts. And he said, "I'm a Muslim, and I have a positive duty to lie to you."
Mm-hmm.
And that became an epiphany. And then while I was there for 2 years, I really started digging into Islamic law. And probably the most revealing text that I got was Reliance of the Traveler.
Right.
Now, the Reliance of the Traveler is significant because it is the Shafi School of Law
Mm-hmm.
doctrinal text. Now, there are 4 schools of law in the Sunni tradition: Hanbal, Hanafi, Malik, and Shafi. And it just so happens that the Shafi text, Reliance of the Traveler, if you read the forward pages, there are some introductory pages for certifications from the various authorities in the United States.
Right, they're stamped.
Yep, and one of them is out of Herndon, Virginia, that states that this text is applicable to North America.
Correct.
So if you have an intelligence analyst who is looking at Islamic issues and does not have a copy of Reliance of the Traveler on his desk, you have an analyst that is not doing his job well.
There's a big gap there, right?
And you have a supervisor that is not doing his job well either. And now we start wading into the issue of training and awareness and what's going on.
Right. I wanted to ask you about penetration, because I actually think that Islam was probably on my radar a little bit before it was on yours. I think it was. We had several Iranian students come to my hometown where I lived,
Mm-hmm.
and my mother hosted 2 of them in our house. And they were Iranian men, and one was quite a bit younger, one was older and one was younger. And they lived with us for about 6 months. And once a month, they would travel from my town, Taft, California, outside of Bakersfield, up to Fresno, where they would have their meetings. And looking back on it now, I'm sure that they were Muslim Brotherhood meetings. And I'm thinking back on all of the things that happened in our house with these gentlemen there. And I do have a copy of The Reliance of the Traveler.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting to me was their what is prescribed or obligatory in this book about their personal grooming habits.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had quite a few issues in the house with them when they came over.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very primitive people. And there were a lot of things that my mother had to teach them.
Mm-hmm.
So it was quite an interesting time. But I've read very little, Bill, about Muslims coming to the United States in 1974, long before the Iranian Revolution in 79,
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was. But the young ladies that were in town with us, they were already covered from head to toe.
Mm-hmm.
And when they came over to our house, the young ladies would come over to the house. They sat on the floor. And there was just many other things like that. And so I would scour through the Reliance of the Traveler, and I would find these exact things. And so it filled in a lot of gaps for me from some of the bizarro things that were happening in my house with these guys. So do you know anything about the penetration of the Muslim Brotherhood into the United States at that time? Because it was definitely through the school system, that they were students.
Mm-hmm. I don't know anything specifically about the penetration of the Muslim Brotherhood into society. My focus is on Islamic law, jihad, and dawah. I can tell you that one of the vulnerabilities that we have as Americans is that we have a fundamental positive belief in everybody else, and we have a hard time to accept that there are challenger civilizations who want to do us harm. Okay? Now, one of the techniques of Muslim Brotherhood penetration is the following. You will have an individual who is a respected member of the community, and he will be sought out by the Kiwanis or Kiwanis or any of the social groups in a town to be a speaker, what have you, or perhaps be elected to a local office, and he will use his connections to bring in others as community members, permanent residents, and expand the base. The other technique that should be of concern is that in some law enforcement agencies, a member will recommend that somebody go to Iran for cross-cultural studies. While that person's in Iran, he's indoctrinated and given a mission to come back. And one of his missions is to spy upward on his handler and then facilitate the reception of other trainees that will go to Iran and come back and set up a network. Now, this is not a broad-based thing that happens, but when it does happen, you'll have one individual that will be the first person to go to a foreign country, to Iran, and be cultivated, and then that sets up a supply chain of additional personnel, and pretty soon you've got this Iranian influence in your own infrastructure.
Right, and they are very good at studying us, and I know that they've come over here with that in their mind, more than just, gaining knowledge or going to school. And I mean, they really were about exploiting what we have and learning about us so they could take it back to their country. This is something I remember them talking about when I was little.
Yes.
Everything about us. So, so let's skip forward a little bit about our current situation on our school campuses. I feel like, and you dedicate your book to the investigator or to the person who is warning the rest of society, and then those who are really willing to listen. And you talk about political correctness being a problem, and you talk about the cognitive dissonance of our leaders, being a problem, making a nice cocktail that just does nothing but help the enemy deceive us. I feel like in the media now, with because of what's happening on our school campuses with these Students for Justice in Palestine and the uprisings because of the war between Israel and Gaza right now, I don't think that I have ever heard so much talk about Islam and jihad, whereas before there's always talk of Islamophobia, or they're not all that bad, or pandering to the enemy. Now it seems like it's much, much more out in the open. Is this something we've been waiting for to happen? This will be the good thing that's coming out of all of this, is that your average person is going to have a lot more awareness of what jihad is and what its goals are.
We may not see that soon, and here's why. As a result of the 9/11, West Point's Counterterrorism Center set up training classes. The FBI was spending about $1 million a year for courses, what have you. And when Nadal Hassan shot up Fort Hood, the question was, why didn't we see this coming? And the answer may have been the following. In one of the training classes, the director of the Counterterrorism Center, at the end of one course, said that congratulations were in order for a specific individual for having received an appointment or an accolade from the Saudi Arabian government, an induction from the Saudi Arabian government to the Royal Saudi Order for the Preservation and Protection of Muhammad's Reputation, or words to that effect. And it just so happened that he was the course designer for the course that West Point was teaching and offering to government employees. That means that he had a positive duty, if you look at Reliance of the Traveler, to soft pedal jihad. Now, jihad is a warfare activity that was taught by Muhammad to his companions. The violence that's associated with it is straight from the 7th century, 6th century, under Muhammad's direction. Now, the problem we run into is that when the government started to talk about jihad and the Islamic association with that phenomenon, lobby groups began to pressure the government to protect Arabs and Muslims from recrimination.
Right.
Now, then they invoked the...
and these would be foreign agents,
well,
right? Under FARA?
Well, the image that they invoked was how the Japanese were treated by the Americans after Pearl Harbor. That's a different story. But what happened, that the detailed instruction about Islamic law was never fully offered to the government agents. So they didn't understand the, for example, contents of Reliance of the Traveler. And gradually, we took the word jihad out of the lexicon. Obama and Eric Holder pressured U.S. intelligence agencies to censor that word. And Brennan, who was a White House staff member at the time and later head of the CIA, took the word jihad and soft-pedaled the term. And you can read this in detail in John Gentry's book, Neutering the CIA. It's replete with examples of the politicization of intelligence and the suppression of the jihad analysis. As a result of that, today, if you take a look at your counterterrorism and terrorism texts and the terrorism and counterterrorism syllabi in the various universities, you will see that their emphasis is on terrorism and do not discuss jihad. Terrorism is an act of violence, and it is not a rule-bound act. Jihad is a legal duty and a religious obligation. It is an act of devotion. And that legal duty and act of devotion and the associated rules that are in play are not being discussed by law enforcement. And the test for that is to look in the bibliographies and the notes sections of the various texts and syllabi to see if they identify the 11 doctrinal sources for Sunni law that are the foundational doctrine for jihad. And your listeners, if they will email you for that list, I'll provide it to you and you can send it to them.
Okay, that's great.
Because what happens, you will find people that will talk freely about terrorism, but they are not talking about jihad. And a more classic example of this is your, quote, lone wolf studies or lone wolf textbooks. And the textbooks and the studies will intermingle jihadists they're not lone wolves. They're autonomous, self-actualizing individuals who are part of a larger ummah or larger collection of a community. And under the rules of jihad, if that one person acts to fulfill that obligation, the remainder of the people are generally relieved of that obligation as long as that one person acts. So the lone wolf, in the Islamic sense, is actually working as part of the community. Also, in your lone wolf studies, they will deconstruct the Islamic actor as much as they can, but they don't get into the motivational doctrine. And again, the proof for that is in the notes section and the references. Those doctrinal sources are not stated.
Yeah, that's incredible. Did you know Phil Haney?
Yes. Phil Haney and I met each other, and he first approached me in my capacity as an intelligence analyst, and he invited me over to his house, and we had some detailed discussions about the phenomenon that he was observing, and basically all the activity was in his arena and not mine. So
How did he find you?
well,
How did he know that you might be someone he'd want to talk
know.
to?
I don't know exactly how our paths crossed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I really don't remember that.
Yeah.
Now, ultimately, your question is going to lead to, did Phil Haney commit suicide? I knew Phil Haney, and he was laboring under a lot of stress.
Yes.
His wife died of cancer, and I fully appreciate and understand the stresses that he was under. But based on the physical evidence and my understanding of the autopsy results and what have you, I have to come down on the side of saying that yes, it was a self-inflicted wound. It was a suicide.
Okay.
That is not a popular view, but as an intelligence analyst, my job is to tell the truth and use the documentation available.
I think there are people that have come out and that was their conclusion as well. Others said that no, it was a happy time in his life. He was getting remarried. He was happy, and he was coming out with a new book, and they might have killed him because he was coming out with a new book.
Yeah, I don't believe they'd kill him over a new book. Murphy's Law. The simplest explanation generally is the best one until you can add more evidence to step away from that, simplest explanation. Not Murphy's Law, I'm sorry. Murphy's Law is the one where you make a mistake. Holy smokes, I can't remember what it is. Yeah, Murphy's Law.
In any essence, another someone who had an incredible life and found himself on the side of studying about our Islamic challengers.
Yes.
And developing programs within the Department of Homeland Security. Is his work going to live on, or did Obama and the people pressuring him, is that all destroyed? It's my understanding that he had 300 open investigations when they closed the door on him as well. So I am wondering about his body of work, and do you think there's any hope that Homeland Security and going forward, there will be a renewed and open dialogue on jihad? I know that Ted Cruz is talking about it now.
With regard to Phil Haney's work, those are electronic files within Homeland Security. I can't speak to Homeland Security because I have not ever worked in there. I would, however, recommend that people get a hold of John Gentry's book, Neutering the CIA, and take a look at the politicization of the intelligence communities by the Obama administration. Mr. Gentry, Dr. Gentry, is quite specific in stating the interference that had come from the Obama administration through Brennan and others.
Do you think Obama at the time knew what he was doing? That it was deliberate and that he was going to be benefiting our enemies, or do you think he's just trying to massage it? And what do you think about?
Candidate Obama said that he wanted to fundamentally transform America.
Right.
Now, that's a utterance of importance. He went to high school in Indonesia, not Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And the formative years are your high school years and a little bit younger. His worldview is materially different than that of Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Franklin.
Mm-hmm. Large demographic of Islamic peoples in Indonesia, like one of the largest from what I've read. So I would imagine it was at the time. We know so little about him. There's so many gaps in the Obama story. And the Michelle Obama story, there just seems to be years and years of nothing that we don't know anything about.
That particular field is outside my target set. Imagine the concentric circles in a bullseye. And my three inner circles are Islamic law, then the practice of Islamic law outside of that, and then the juristic schools for those three rings.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, it's a little bit beyond my peripheral vision. My area of focus is Islamic law.
So what do you see as street jihad today?
Street jihad today. Street jihad today is autonomous self-actualization and the execution of a legal duty and the discharge of a religious obligation. Jihad is a parallel penetration along with dawah. Dawah is the peaceful application of social change, proselyting and what have you.
Interfaith.
But both have the objective of subduing their host and asserting that Islamic law as a primary culture.
Are we seeing that in these protests?
Yes.
I've seen this myself here when I go out. I think this past year was the first year that I've actually seen a mass, prayer happening at an event, down at the Capitol in Texas. But now we're seeing students praying, and they're taking the Shahada. So right out there on campus, and they're joining in. So
the Shahada, once it's taken in the Islamic view, you're a Muslim forever.
Yeah, right.
But more importantly, the person who can convince an individual to take the Shahada earns merit in the eyes of Allah. So it becomes a contest to see who you can convert and how many.
So they keep track.
Well, not necessarily. They will rely on Allah to keep track. They just establish a pattern of trying to convert. As a result of that, you have a very tenacious activity, very tenacious agenda. And one of the things that is really important to understand and remember Muhammad may be one of the greatest human beings in history, and here's why. He created a religion, he created a society, he created a culture, he created a legal system, and he created a civilization. No other human being has created a civilization. I could be wrong, but I'd like to be told who else.
Yeah, well, we'll think about that, but you're right. And it's incredible. They're quite devout, and they are very successful in London, in Germany, with the Hijra
Mm-hmm.
and the immigration. Do you think they're going to be as successful here as they are in London?
Yes, and here's why. The Ummah is incredibly cohesive.
Mm-hmm.
If you reread Reliance the Traveler, there are multiple passages that tell each reader you have a positive duty to participate in the activities of your peers to advance Islam. You have a positive duty to defend your peers from law enforcement or any force that would try to restrain their activities. Specifically in Reliance of the Traveler, there's a great discussion on obligatory lying. While lying is regarded as a distasteful thing, if you have an obligation and you can't meet it by any other way, you have the permission to lie, and if the obligation is obligatory, the lying becomes obligatory. There's a more specific example of creating a misimpression. For example, and these are the words used in the Reliance of the Traveler. If a policeman comes to your door and asks, "Is so-and-so here?" you know that basically he is saying, "Here in your house." But you can answer by saying, "No, he is not here," intending the space between the two of you.
Mm.
So Reliance of the Traveler is an excellent rule book on interpersonal communications and the obligations for pursuing dawah and jihad. As a result of that, you will find a lot of cohesiveness among the students or the jihadists, and that kind of cohesiveness is not part and parcel to the American culture. Because of that, they could well be successful.
They could be. Why do things have to get to a crisis point before we act?
Let me ask the question, who is the we you're talking about? And the reason I asked that was rhetorical. The reason I asked that, you have different political philosophies in the United States. By course cutting those philosophies, you have basically the Democrats and the Republicans. If you go on the internet and you search for the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, eventually somewhere down that list, you'll come to a website that will say that the Democrats' philosophical background is Marx and
Lenin,
and
Stalin,
well,
Mao.
Yeah, a list of
Mao is a favorite.
yeah, a list of leftist leftist philosophers.
Right.
On the Republican side, it'll talk about Plato, Socrates, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin,
Hmm.
and there are two different ideological sources at work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take a look, the Democrat Party is all about control and power. To assert, to take control, they want to do things like pack the Supreme Court, do away with the Electoral College, artificially inflate their electoral vote capabilities by permitting all of the illegal immigration, which in the 2030 census doesn't count citizens, it counts population.
Mm.
And as long as they can pack a lot, there's been 10 million illegals brought into this country under Biden.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That translates into a hell of a large electoral expansion for the Democrats.
Right.
Now, that's just to gain power. Continuing with the gaining power is the dilution of our culture, the removal of our institutions. For example, reducing all the statues and taking the Indian off the butter.
Mm-hmm.
And
the change of our language as well, different words.
Yeah. Now that's how they.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they want to do to
Mm-hmm.
gain power, but to control power, to stay in power. The other half of their agenda is to restrict the First Amendment, restrict the Second Amendment, and bring in Washington and Puerto Rico as states to consolidate their power.
Mm-hmm.
And I can provide you a graphic that will illustrate this quite nicely that you can make available to your people. So the problem, the crisis comes when the agenda of one side finally becomes so apparent that the other side says, wait a minute, something else is happening here.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that the people advancing the deconstructionist or the destructive agenda have a sense of purpose, and the other side is sort of wandering around aimlessly, kind of oblivious, because they don't have the capability, they don't have the capability to understand the amount of hate or the amount of evil that is confronting them.
They don't understand Marxism, and they don't understand how to fight the enemy. They just don't. I mean, that to me is very apparent. We have a.
Here's the problem. How do you fight? The left will use violence and destruction. Look at Portland, Chicago, Detroit, the riot cities. The right doesn't do that. It serves no useful purpose. The left will conduct violence against individuals. Who is the right going to conduct violence against? Police, individuals? That's just not the way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So these guys have the initiative, and they've got the resolve to do it.
They do, and they're not going away.
Correct.
And people are starting to slowly wake up a little bit, but they tend to think that by, putting a Republican in office at the local level, whether it be a district attorney or somebody in the city council, that's going to solve the problem, and it doesn't, because you still have another person who just may not be creative enough or is going to operate within the laws with a bunch of people who aren't operating within the laws. We already have quite a mess in Austin, from the defunding of the police and what I see as clear Marxism in play in Austin with the activist groups. And they have been very successful and in getting control of the economic sector and having equity commissions set up and the various things that they do, and we find ourselves in quite a mess right now. That's going to be hard to get them out and hard to undo some of the things they've done. They have made good progress with firing the diversity, equity, and inclusion team at the University of Texas. I think that is going to help. It's made a lot of people very angry. The ones who used to be at the boardroom are no longer welcome in the boardroom, as Austin also has a new mayor. And so hopefully these types of things are going to catch on, and people are going to catch on to what they've done, and we can undo some of it.
Yes. You made the observation that electing Republicans isn't enough. That's true. Don't elect Republicans. Elect conservatives who happen to be Republicans, because you can always put your focus on the Republicans and get a rhino.
Right.
So vet your candidates and make sure that they are conservatives. How do they stand on the Second Amendment? How do they stand on state level legislation? For example, we have some Republicans who voted with the Democrats to change the punishment from a felony to a misdemeanor for illegals voting in elections. Well, a Republican voted for that, but is he a conservative? No. We are going to have to do a better job at vetting conservatives. And then we're going to have to do a better job at going to the town meetings and what have you.
Right, getting active and participating.
And really holding people to their conservative standards.
So, what is your worldview?
My worldview is straight out of Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Dr. Samuel Huntington was a Harvard University department chair, and he reasoned that there are 6 or 7 civilizations on Earth. The Russians, which are the Orthodox, the Japanese, which are Japanese, the Chinese, which are the Cynic, the Islamic civilization, the Judaic civilization, the Western civilization, which we're a part of, and 2 others that he had a hard time labeling: the Pan-African civilization, and then the Pan-Hispanic civilization, anything outside of Spain. Now, he elaborated on the following. The borders between civilizations tend to be bloody. Ask Russia and Germany. Germany was part of Western civilization and attacked the Orthodox. France, Napoleon, attacked the Russians, Western civilization versus the Orthodox. Now, when the Americans and the British took on the Nazis, that was internal housekeeping. But when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor after occupying China, that was the Japanese against Western civilization, the Japanese against the Cynic civilization. And in 1905, when they attacked Russia, that was Japanese against the Orthodox civilization. Now, we have Islam, which does not act like a civilization with a major country causing international problems. We have Islam as a ummah, a body of people at the individual level who are advancing their Islamic agenda, their civilizational agenda against their host countries. The difference is, if I understood Huntington correctly, that generally civilizations are defensive and really don't want to wage war against another civilization, with the notable exception of the very errant leadership of 1930s Japan, the Bushido tradition, and then Hitler and Napoleon, which were personality driven. China, for example, has not launched a cross-border war of expansion for 3,000 years. Now she has done border adjustments, okay, but nothing like what Germany did or what the Japanese did. So we look at Islam, and Islam is offensive aggressive, and that's part of their doctrine, and that's not an indictment. That's just simply saying their temperature runs hotter than everybody else's.
Do you think there's going to be a World War III in Europe?
World War III means that the countries outside of Europe are going to be involved
in a kinetic hot war in Europe. Yeah.
I would submit that it would be a localized war of a short, limited duration, which may trigger an international response from the United States.
Okay.
And depending on what Britain and France do, one of the reasons that France has nuclear weapons is primarily defensive against a Russian threat. And if the Russians advance toward France, they will stop them cold in Germany, and the Germans will suffer the most for that.
Right. I don't think the Russians have to be right on their doorstep, so to speak. I mean, they've already told them, don't get any closer because we're getting ready for you.
Yeah.
So
hopefully cooler heads will prevail.
Yeah, let's hope, right?
Let me back up. Hope is not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. So instead of hopefully cooler heads should prevail, we should insist that cooler heads prevail.
We should, because the weapons are frightening. And it's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to be good for us. So thank you for coming. Thank you for doing an interview with me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.